1943, Auschwitz. A young boy, no older than 6, sits in a cold, sterile room. He clutches his twin brother's hand, the only comfort in a place where comfort does not exist. The door swings open, and in walks a man in a crisp SS uniform, his boots clicking against the concrete floor. Dr. Josef Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death. He smiles. One twin is injected with a mysterious substance. The other left untouched. A test, an experiment to see how long it takes for one to die, and if the other will suffer the same fate. And this was just one of thousands of gruesome experiments carried out in Nazi concentration camps under the name of science. They tortured, poisoned, mutilated, and dissected human beings without anesthesia, all in pursuit of racial purity and medical advancements for the Third Reich. The world would later call them war criminals, and yet, some of these very same doctors were never punished. In fact, after the war, they were given new identities, new jobs, and even American citizenship. The US government recruited them. Why? Because their knowledge, gained through human suffering, was considered too valuable to waste. These were not just crimes, they were some of the most horrific violations of human life ever recorded. So, what exactly happened inside those Nazi medical labs? How did doctors, men who swore to heal, become torturers in white coats? And how did some of them end up working for the very countries that once vowed to bring them to justice? It's time to uncover the truth. The horrors of Nazi medical experiments didn't happen in secret. They weren't the work of rogue scientists or mad doctors operating in the shadows. No, these crimes were fully sanctioned, state-funded, and carried out under the twisted logic of Nazi ideology. To understand how doctors, men who had taken an oath to heal, became monsters in lab coats, we have to go back to the core belief that drove Nazi medical experiments: eugenics. Eugenics was the idea that the human race could be improved by controlling who was allowed to reproduce. It wasn't invented by the Nazis. Many countries, including the US, had eugenics programs in the early 1900s. But the Nazis took it to the extreme. They believed that certain groups, Jews, Romani people, Slavs, the disabled, were genetically inferior and needed to be eliminated to strengthen the Aryan race. For the Nazis, mass murder wasn't just about war, it was about biological warfare. And who carried out this so-called science? Doctors, scientists, researchers. Some of them had been respected physicians before the war, but under Hitler, they became architects of cruelty, using human bodies as disposable test subjects in the name of medical advancement. The most infamous of them all was Dr. Josef Mengele, known as the Angel of Death. Mengele worked at Auschwitz, selecting prisoners for gas chambers with a flick of his wrist. If the Angel of Death had a favorite project, it was twins. Dr. Josef Mengele believed that by studying twins, he could unlock the secrets of genetic superiority, allowing the Nazis to breed a perfect Aryan race. But his research was nothing short of nightmarish. Sometimes twins were measured, studied, and subjected to painful tests, all without anesthesia. Or one twin would be injected with a disease, while the other was kept healthy, to see if one's suffering would affect the other. Mengele also stitched twins together to create artificially conjoined twins, leaving them to die of infection. And if one twin died from an experiment, Mengele would kill the other, just to compare their organs. To Mengele, twins were disposable, but for the children he experimented on, it was a slow, torturous death, and he was just getting started. Soon the Nazi war machine needed stronger soldiers, and they needed to know how much the human body could endure in extreme conditions. Enter Dr. Sigmund Rascher. His job, find out how long a human could survive in freezing temperatures before death. Prisoners were stripped naked and forced into ice-cold water for hours. Others were left outside in the snow overnight to see if they could be revived. Some were even reheated using scalding water or exposure to naked women, to test the most effective way to warm up frostbitten soldiers. Most victims didn't survive, and those who did were often forced to endure it again. High-altitude experiments, the chamber of death. What happens to a human body when it's exposed to extreme altitudes without oxygen? Unsurprisingly, the Nazis wanted to know. Prisoners were locked inside low-pressure chambers, where the air was slowly removed. Some suffocated to death. Others had their lungs rupture before they lost consciousness. A few were vivisected while still alive, so doctors could examine their organs in real time. All of this was done to supposedly help Nazi pilots survive high-altitude combat, but in reality, it was torture disguised as science. Sterilization and reproductive experiments, controlling the future. The Nazis didn't just want to kill their enemies, they wanted to erase them entirely, and that meant preventing them from having children. Thousands of women were forcibly sterilized, many of them under the knife of Dr. Karl Klauberg, who injected chemicals directly into their reproductive organs. Some were subjected to high-dose radiation, leaving them permanently infertile. In the worst cases, doctors removed entire reproductive systems without anesthesia to see how the body would react. For many victims, death would have been merciful, because what they endured was worse than death itself. Chemical and poison experiments, weapons of mass murder. The Nazis weren't just interested in testing the limits of the human body, they wanted better ways to kill. At Ravensbrück concentration camp, female prisoners were injected with deadly bacteria to see how wounds would fester under battlefield conditions. At Dachau, prisoners were forced to drink seawater for weeks with no food to test survival limits. At Buchenwald, victims were injected with experimental poisons, some of which killed instantly, while others caused slow, agonizing deaths. Some prisoners were force-fed lethal gases, testing new chemical weapons for the Nazi war effort. They weren't just experimenting on people, they were turning human beings into lab rats. When the war ended in 1945, the world saw the full extent of the horrors committed inside Nazi concentration camps, mass graves, gas chambers, starving prisoners barely clinging to life, and at the heart of these horrors, the doctors, who had turned human beings into test subjects. Surely they would all be brought to justice. But that's not what happened. In 1946, the Allies put 23 Nazi doctors and scientists on trial in what became known as the Nuremberg Doctors' Trial. Their crimes: murdering prisoners in medical experiments, torturing victims in the name of science, using human beings like disposable lab rats, and more. The prosecution laid out the horrific details: twins dismembered, people frozen to death, children poisoned like insects in a laboratory. Only 7 were sentenced to death. Another 7 received prison sentences, and the rest, they walked free. Josef Mengele, the most infamous doctor of them all, never saw the inside of a courtroom. As the war ended, he fled. He hid in Germany for years before escaping to South America under a false identity. After his escape, he lived a comfortable life in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, evading capture for decades. Despite survivors and Nazi hunters searching for him, he always stayed one step ahead. Then, in 1979, Mengele died of a stroke while swimming on a beach in Brazil. No trial, no justice, just a quiet death in exile. Operation Paperclip, when the US recruited Nazi scientists. Some Nazi doctors didn't run. Some were invited to continue their work. Under Operation Paperclip, the United States secretly recruited over 1,600 Nazi scientists, doctors, and engineers. Instead of being prosecuted, many were given new identities, new jobs, and even American citizenship. For example, Dr. Hubertus Strughold, who oversaw Nazi high-altitude experiments that killed prisoners, later became a NASA scientist. Dr. Kurt Blome, who worked on biological warfare experiments, was recruited by the US Army's chemical weapons program. Dr. Walter Schreiber, who conducted horrific experiments on prisoners, ended up working for the US Air Force. The justification: if we don't use them, the Soviets will. But for the victims, it was a betrayal. The very men who tortured them, maimed them, and murdered their families were now living free lives, working for the same countries that had claimed to seek justice. For the few who survived Nazi medical experiments, life never returned to normal. Many suffered from lifelong injuries, missing limbs, blindness, infertility. Psychological trauma haunted them forever. Flashbacks, nightmares, the constant terror that it could happen again. Some survivors spoke out, but for decades, their voices were ignored or forgotten. They were left to pick up the pieces, while their torturers disappeared into history. However, the Nuremberg trials did have one lasting impact. They led to the creation of the Nuremberg Code, a set of ethical guidelines for human experimentation, including voluntary consent being absolutely essential. Experiments need to have a clear medical purpose, and subjects must be allowed to stop at any time. This became the foundation for modern medical ethics, a direct response to what the Nazis had done. But still, a dark question remains. If the world had truly learned its lesson, why did so many of these doctors escape justice? When the Nuremberg trials exposed the horrors of Nazi medical experiments, the world reacted with shock, disgust, and outrage. But did we truly learn from it? Because even today, the echoes of these atrocities remain. Here's a disturbing reality. Some of the medical data collected by Nazi doctors is still referenced today. Cold exposure experiments, the ones where prisoners were frozen alive. Some of that data was used in hypothermia research for emergency medicine and military survival training. Pressure chamber studies, where prisoners suffocated to death. Modern aerospace medicine has drawn from some of those findings. Certain surgical techniques, tested in horrific conditions, laid the groundwork for procedures still used today. So the question remains, if knowledge is gained through evil, should it ever be used? Medical ethics still grapple with that debate. For decades, many survivors of these experiments were ignored. Most were never compensated. Many were silenced, their suffering written off as wartime casualties, and others lived with lifelong injuries and trauma, never receiving justice. Even today, some families still search for answers, wondering if their lost relatives were among those tortured in Nazi labs. So, the question is, could this happen again? After World War II, the world swore it wouldn't, but history has a way of repeating itself. In the 1940s, the Tuskegee syphilis study in the US secretly let black men suffer untreated syphilis just to study the disease's effects. During the Cold War, both the US and Soviet Union conducted unethical human experiments, including radiation exposure and psychological torture. Even today, there are reports of unethical medical testing on vulnerable populations in some parts of the world. And now, the question is yours to answer. Should medical knowledge gained through such horrors ever be used? Was the US right to recruit these doctors under the guise of scientific advancement? Or should every shred of their research have been buried with their victims? Let us know in the comments. And if you found this story important, subscribe now for more deep dives into history's most nefarious chapters. Because the past isn't just something we remember, it's something we must learn from.